Hello and welcome to another video about professional communication with me, Bill Perkins. Today we're going to briefly talk about a few points from Chapter 2 and 3. The first one is to explain the four purposes of nonverbal communication by giving a concrete example of each at work. The four purposes of nonverbal communication, the first one is to express emotion. Our body language shows how we're feeling. Are we sick, tired, happy? Or how we feel about things or information we're receiving. Do we agree, disagree, angry, happy? An example of this is that I had a boss, Mrs. W., who owned her own company, who always felt everything deeply and expected everyone to do the same. You always knew how Miss W. felt the minute she walked in the door. You knew if she'd been fighting with her husband before she came into work. On one occasion, in an emergency meeting, not really an emergency, it was already done, nothing to do about it. She was so upset with what an employee had done, and it was bad and illegal. She was waving her arms, her face was red, she was crying, pacing up and down, fanning herself, just really losing it. She was yelling at myself and the other supervisors, insulting us, calling into question our own purpose for being there, and demanding that we each take responsibility for the fact of what the employee had done, and to show some kind of emotional remorse for what had happened. And she wasn't happy until she could try and get everybody to cry or, perform some sort of body language that made her feel like we really felt as badly as she did. I didn't. Later conversation with her friend Mrs. K revealed she was actually more worried about the effect that employee's action would have on her company and not really about what he'd done. The next part of purpose of nonverbal communication is to convey interpersonal attitudes. How do we feel about others? How do we feel about things, places, so forth? Well, obviously, we always knew Mrs. W. hated coming into the office. Her whole attitude changed. Her teeth would clench. She'd get this hard look on her face. She was always just, her posture was just aggressive. Okay, so that was one thing. The next part of what nonverbal communication is to express personality. Are we loud? Do we use a lot of hand gestures like me? Are we quiet and reserved? Are we humorous? Mrs. W. was loud, overbearing, opinionated. She knew more and cared more than anybody else, and she was always making sure you knew it. She liked to really give you a hard stare. If you tried to talk to her, if you went into her office, she was very dismissive in her body language. She'd turn her back on you, play with papers, take phone calls while you're trying to talk to her, make phone calls while you're trying to talk to her. And the last purpose of nonverbal communication, to accompany verbal communication, to repeat, strengthen the overall communication, or even to conflict with it when the body language doesn't agree with the message. For instance, at this particular job, my boss, Mrs. W., had another employee that worked there, Mrs. K., that they were the best of friends. At least that's the way it appeared. Mrs. K. was very careful to make sure her body language always was very friendly and open with Mrs. W., but behind her back, she told us everything that Mrs. W. was talking about, everything that went on in Mrs. W.'s personal life. They were not friends. Final thought, I think honestly that Mrs. W. felt out of place as the head of the company and was just actually terribly insecure, which led her to acting like an ass most of the time. Next question, what are the dimensions of nonverbal communication and how do they help us interpret and make sense of verbal communication? The three dimensions of nonverbal communication are immediacy. We react to things by evaluating them as positive or negative, good or bad. And the next one is status. We perceive behaviors that indicate various aspects of status to us. Rich, poor, strong, weak, superior, subordinate. There's a power balance that we respond to. Responsiveness is the last one. We perceive that there's an active or passive in the conversation, in our response, and this signals the intensity of our feelings about a person or a subject. Are we showing an interest in it? Are we looking at it, touching, smiling, or are we trying to get away? At work, okay, in the past, as I've said before, I worked with developmentally disabled adults who were mostly nonverbal. And all of that played a large part in understanding what the communication was they were trying to get across to us. So I want to rearrange things a little bit. With them, the first thing was status. They were very good at perceiving status and also enforcing it. You may have thought you were the boss and they were the subordinate, but no. In most cases, it was the exact opposite. And they could create that power balance in their actions and their body language towards you. The second one was immediacy and how they would react to things by evaluating them as positive or negative. If they liked something, they would engage in it. They'd get closer to it. If they didn't, they'd pull away from it. And then finally, responsiveness, that intensity of our feelings. With somebody that is developmentally disabled and nonverbal, that can go from mild to extreme very easily, very quickly. Some clients, if they didn't like something, they just pushed it away. Others pick it up, throw it across the room. If you tried to get them to engage in something that they didn't want to do, an activity, brushing their teeth, you could end up with toothpaste in your hair very quickly. So those are the dimensions of nonverbal communication. In Chapter 3, we're going to discuss at least 2 barriers to listening with a personal example and how those barriers impact listening. So for me, the 2 big ones I always focus on is jargon, technical words used by specialized groups, and message overload. When somebody is giving you so many details and so much information that you just can't process it. For a brief time, I worked as a tax preparer at a well-known company. To do the job, I attended 8 training sessions once a week for 3 to 4 hours. The person who did the training was well-informed and prepared. However, he used a lot of terms that are only applicable to accountants and not the average everyday person who was coming in to take this class. He didn't give definitions or explanations of the words he was using, and he used a lot of it, a lot of jargon. He would also create a whole bunch of message overload by going so far into detail and examples and numbers and percentages and so forth that soon you're completely lost, or at least I was. I had message overload. I found myself often trying to understand the information that he had just presented while he's way over here on a whole nother topic. So I was frequently lost. If it had not been for the manuals, computer programs, and relying on people that were already working in the field to help me understand, I would never have been able to do the job. The impact was that I struggled far more to understand, learn, and implement than I should have had to, which made me feel insecure about my ability to do the job the first year. The next question for Chapter 3, discuss the 4 listening styles preferences. Which are you, and how do you respond when communicating with others who do not share your style? Well, there are 4, and the first is people-orientated listeners who focus on the emotional content and trying to understand and identify with the emotion of the sender. There's action-orientated listeners who want direct, concise, error-free communication that has a goal. There's content-orientated listeners who are interested in the intellectual challenge of the information. And time-orientated listeners who want the messages brief, to the point, concise. They don't need a whole lot of extra information or thoughts in it. I think all of those at different times, depending on the role I'm in and who I'm talking to, what's going on around us. Do I have other things to do? Are we planning something, an activity? So forth. But I can honestly say that mostly I am the content-orientated listener type. I want to understand what I'm hearing. I have questions, thoughts, ideas about what I'm hearing. I'm the person that, is always asking questions and trying to paraphrase back at you to get more information. With people-orientated listeners, I usually become a little bored with them, honestly. Emotion to me frequently clouds the message. I want them to get to the point. I don't care how you feel about it. So I try to nudge them to stick to the facts. With action-orientated listeners, I usually get along, though they can be to me in a bit of a hurry to go out and do and accomplish rather than to listen and plan. So I try to give them all the info before I give them something to do in action. The other one, time-orientated listeners. Sometimes I feel rushed with these types of people, and that maybe they're not really understanding me or I'm not understanding them, because it seems like they leave out a lot of stuff and they just expect you to know what they didn't say. So with them, I try to ask questions and make them feel that their time is very important to me. I know you're needed somewhere else, but without your input, this cannot get done right. So that's how I deal with that situation. So those are the 4 questions for this video. Thank you for once again sticking with me through it, and I look forward to seeing your video and reading your thoughts about mine. Have a great day. Thank you.